This setup is for the same objects, two spheres, but in this case I've got a glossy material instead of a glassy material. First sphere is just a glossy shader. The second sphere is a glossy shader and a diffuse shader using a layer weight node connected to the facing output. The facing output gives you the best effect when working with glossy materials and diffuse materials, because this mimics the behavior of substances that are rough when you look straight down on them, but become shiny as you look at them at a glancing angle. If you swap this, you get the opposite effect. In this case, you get it's shiny in the middle and less shiny on the edge. You crank that value up, you get the opposite result. So it's shiny in the middle and diffuse along the edge. You could also do something like this if you take the facing and connect it to the roughness. You get a similar. You can have a similar effect. And what happens is you can have shiny in the middle and rough as you go out to the outside. If you want to reverse it, you would have to subtract. I'm guessing this is a 0 to 1 value, so you would have to subtract 1 from 1. You would have to subtract this from 1, and it would be rough in the middle and shiny as you go out to the edge. Let's put this back the way I had it. Okay, there. The Fresnel doesn't seem to work for this setup. When I use the Fresnel, it seems like I get a constant amount of mixing between the two. There is no weird interaction that takes place between the Fresnel and the glossy shader like there appears to be between the Fresnel and the glass shader or the refractive index shader. There's just a constant amount of diffuse material over the entire surface, dependent on the amount of blend. If I set this to 0.1, it's mostly shiny. It's almost entirely shiny. If I set this to 0.99, it just looks like a diffuse shiny material on the surface of a blue ball. And even though this is 0.99, I'm still getting enough glossiness to shine through. Now this could be because I'm using blue as a dark color, and it's easier to see these highlights off of a dark color than if I use them against the light color. If I switch to, let's say, yellow, the highlights disappear. They're still there, but they're harder to see. If I now go to a smaller material, it's easier to see. So that's probably what the problem is, that it's blue. Blue's a dark color, so it's easy to see the highlights even when you have a tiny amount of gloss. It's obvious that they're there. So again, the gloss, the interaction between the color of the object and the glossiness and the factor as affected by things like Fresnel, all of these come into play. You can't ignore any one of them. They all work together to produce weird effects that may not work the way you think they do, and maybe in some cases may be counterintuitive. So you just have to be careful when taking that into account. Like I said, again, I would stick with in this case I would stick with the facing output, because that gives you the effect that is expected for shiny material, where it's either shiny in the middle and rough on the edge, or rough in the middle or diffuse in the middle and shiny on the edge. I decided to fill it around more with the refraction, or in this case glassy shader, and the Fresnel, and play around and see exactly what is going on. Well, I understand how Fresnel works, but it looks like it really only works if you keep the refractive index of the Fresnel shader and the refractive index of the glass or the refraction shader the same. And it appears that all it really does is it adds this rim around the edge, regardless of how high you crank up the refractive index. So if I crank up the refractive index to a very high value, as long as they're both the same, the sphere looks the same. So whether I have, a refractive index of 1.7 or a refractive index of 1.2, as long as they're the same, I get the same effect. The refraction in the center with a slow tapering to the diffuse on the edge, or typically what is done is you use a glossy shader instead of a diffuse so that you get more glossiness at the edge. It becomes more and more reflective as you approach the edge. Maybe that works better than with a diffuse shader. I mean, if I turn this up now to 2, that's what it looks like. It just becomes very reflective, although there's still this dark area here, so it's not 100% gloss. It's 100% gloss with a dark background. Okay, so if I turn the refractive index of the glass shader to be the same as the Fresnel, well, it doesn't really look any different at a refractive index of 2 than it does at a refractive index at 1.2. There might be less glossiness on it, because that looks like that does appear to be happening at a higher refractive index. There's more glossiness on it. But I could achieve the same thing by just mixing it without this. Who needs that? I could do the same thing by just playing with this, even though in this case it's just a uniform amount of glossiness rather than increasing glossiness at the edge. So I would still prefer to use the layer weight node and use the facing output, because here the transition is a little bit better. You can see that the glossiness increases in a smooth rate from the center to the edge, depending on the blending value, and the refractive index is now, in a sense, independent from this shading that's happening here. So by using the layer weight node with a facing output, you can control the rate of the transition between the two shaders, independent of the refractive index of the material, which is not the case with the Fresnel output, with a Fresnel node. You have to have them set to the same, or else you get strange effects where you get that dark border. So, that's another tip. Also, same thing with the diffuse. I mean, if I replace that with a diffuse and use the Fresnel, I have to keep the refractive indexes the same in order to maintain the Fresnel so that it's just at the very edge. Otherwise, I get that dark border like I mentioned earlier in the video. But again, it's like, the facing output, I think, produces the best effect. If you want to produce, something like this, where you have a material that becomes more diffuse around the edge as the angle, the view angle becomes more of a grazing angle, or you can reverse the order and it becomes more reflective as the angle becomes more of a grazing angle. If you want, you can use that. You would use this, for example, to produce a material that has kind of a plastic appearance to it. Use a glossy shader and a diffuse shader, and use the facing output at a low value, probably 0.01. so that it becomes glossy right at the very edge. Although in most cases you would just use the straight mixing and mix the two together at some low amount in order to get the amount of glossiness that you want. And then, you know, add a little bit of roughness to the gloss so it's not so perfect. Then it starts to look like plastic. And then you don't need the facing output unless you want to make it more reflective as you approach the edge. Then you've got to turn this back up to 0.2. Maybe that's too high. 0.1. Then you can, you know, play around with it, make it look a little bit plasticier. So now it's a little bit more reflective around the edge and diffuse in the center. If we use the Fresnel instead, the effect becomes very strong only at the edge. 0.2. The Fresnel gives you a more rapid transition, so you have the center of the image remains more consistent, and then at the very edge it becomes glossy. So this is probably better for creating a plastic material. Use the Fresnel output. I'm sorry, the Fresnel node with, you know, a reasonable refractive index, and you'll get a very high amount of glossiness right at the very edge with some slight amount of glossiness in the middle, like this. Maybe turn the gloss, the fuzziness, the roughness down a little bit. Turn it down 0.05. Something like that, so it looks like plastic.